Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for jumping on our meeting today. My name is Will Cooper. I am a training coordinator for Infowise, and my presentation today is on development strategy related to SharePoint. Specifically, I want to talk about a method where you can develop custom SharePoint solutions without using any code. So we're going to start by just going through a few slides. I want to talk to you a little bit about that approach, and then we'll actually jump into SharePoint. I'll show you some examples and show you what this looks like trying to use this alternative approach. Okay, so some of the topics we're going to cover today. Basically, we're going to take a look at kind of the current challenge that organizations face. So of course, there's a lot of need to build custom solutions, and really that's the opportunity with SharePoint. It's a great platform, and there's the potential to build all kinds of custom solutions taking advantage of its technology, but that's technically difficult. So we're going to talk about what a good strategy looks like, even thinking outside the context of any specific tools. What's the ideal approach to doing that. I'm going to take a look at and explain what I mean by a no-code solution, and then at that point I'm actually going to jump in and show you in SharePoint what does this process look like? How do you actually go through building these solutions without any code? And I'll address issues as far as limitations on the code and that type of thing, and then tell you how you can try this out. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm a SharePoint developer. I do consulting, and I have a background in Microsoft web development. I started with Infowise as a customer of theirs and was able to successfully build a lot of tools using their software. And of course, I'm a big fan. And so now I really enjoy the opportunity to do training and also help explain to organizations and show them how they can use Infowise tools to build things easily. So during the webinar, if you will, please definitely ask some questions. That's really one of the main goals of our webinar today. We hope you let us know what kind of solutions you're thinking about, what your specific needs are. Please do that by entering those questions in the chat interface and go to webinar. Towards the end of the webinar, I'll try to address some of those questions, and then also my business partner, Vladi, will be answering some of those questions in chat. So reach out and let us know what you're thinking about as we go through the presentation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit from the starting point of the problem that many organizations are facing. So we have some challenges as it relates to custom development. So the first one is InfoPath. I think it's pretty well known, and there's been information over the last couple of years. We understand that Microsoft has publicly announced that they don't intend to support that development tool going forward, and that they ultimately will make some kind of alternative plans, but of course that's been delayed, and there's not really a good indication what will happen on that path. So using InfoPath is definitely not going to be a good strategy at this point. SharePoint Designer is certainly a very important tool when creating customization in SharePoint. One challenge there, Microsoft has announced they will not be releasing newer versions of that. So with SharePoint Designer 2013, that represented the final release of that product. Still, it is an important companion tool, but it's not going to be updated. So relying on building things such as SharePoint Workflow using that tool potentially could be a little bit problematic because it's not going to be improved with new versions. Custom solutions that you might build in Visual Studio, of course, that would require programmers with a very deep level of experience and knowledge in SharePoint. So usually that's a pretty rare resource, and in that case you're building solutions that really can only be maintained by those specific people. So that's really not a good situation to be in. And that's more typical of what you might have seen in earlier days with SharePoint in previous versions where there might not have been an alternative approach. So in this kind of situation, you're needing someone with high level of SharePoint knowledge and programming. So very few people have that capability. If you have folks like that in your organization, I expect that they're in great demand. So very likely they're stretched thin and their level of accessibility is not going to be very high. If you reach out and work with other groups to build it for you, of course that's going to be expensive. It's likely to be a very high project cost to bring in a team to develop just because of the level of expertise you need to do this. And then one other issue I wanted to recognize is the level of risk to your organization. When you're doing an upgrade to the SharePoint platform, or if there's any significant changes, it's a very high likelihood that that would break those custom solutions, and then you need those resources to come and fix it. So these are some of the challenges faced by organizations, especially large organizations in SharePoint. You have this great need for custom solutions, but a lot of risks and challenges that come along with that. Okay, so let's talk about, that's kind of the world that many of us live in right now, and let's think about broadly, you know, what would be a better picture in terms of custom solutions that you have on your SharePoint platform. Really, having solutions that can be handled more by SharePoint power users, not programmers, really this is a much better strategy. There's going to be much more people who you might describe as a SharePoint power user. They use the platform a lot, and they have a good understanding of it, but they don't necessarily need to be programmers. It should be a situation where you can fairly easily teach someone the necessary skills to work on these solutions. It shouldn't be you know, a really high level of expertise. Of course, we would ideally like to have a situation like we want to talk about today where programming is not required to create the solution. We would like to not rely on those companion tools such as Visual Studio, SharePoint Designer, InfoPath, things like that. Also, ideally, you'd like to have your departments be able to own their tools. In the situation I described, you really have to lean on your IT group or programmers to maintain that. And so if something breaks, really, the person leading that department, they don't necessarily have anything they can do. They're dependent on someone else to make that fix. Instead, we want to make something accessible that can be maintained and updated by the group that's actually using the tool. With all of that in mind, we still want the ability to be highly custom and have flexibility. So it sounds a bit like a bit of a fantasy, I suppose, but to me, I really think this is a reasonable approach with what I'm going to talk about today. All right, so let's talk about what do I mean by no-code solution. So I mean basically there's nobody's going to have to write any C# or JavaScript or writing code in workflows or that type of thing. And I mentioned we're not going to use those companion tools. We're not going to expect anyone to write any custom HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or any of those type of things. What we are looking for is something where it can be done through configuration instead of debugging code and that type of thing. So as I go through the screens, I hope that you'll pay very close attention. I want you to see that in all of these settings and development, there is actually not any code required. It's just really only a knowledge of some tools that I'm going to show you. Okay, so we're in SharePoint now, and what I want to do is kind of walk you through this approach I mentioned. So Infowise Ultimate Forms is a tool set that augments your SharePoint tools. So out of the box, SharePoint, of course, includes some tools and functionality that you can use to build some basic things, but it really can only get us so far. And what Infowise facilitates is the ability to add all of this extra functionality that we want, specifically to build custom tools. So what you're looking at here, I'm in a SharePoint 2013 on-prem environment. One thing that's cool is with Infowise, their solution fully supports both on-prem SharePoint and Office 365. And for on-prem, any version of the SharePoint product. You don't necessarily have to have Enterprise, for example, or anything like that. So with SharePoint, of course, lists are really a fundamental aspect of SharePoint overall. So that's really kind of where everything starts. Once you have Infowise installed in SharePoint, which is very easy to do, you see some additional interface options. So notice that everything I'm going to do today is in SharePoint. I don't have to go off to some other place to open some other tool and have this open in multiple windows. It's all directly baked into SharePoint. So this puzzle pieces icon is the SharePoint design screen, and this is a hub, if you will, to this functionality. They're the tools that I'm going to be able to use to build my custom solutions in SharePoint. And there's a process that you're going to go through to do this. Okay, so when I'm working with the customer or department or talking to them, the first step is always going to be figuring out, which fields do I need, and I'll go ahead and make the list for that. So even before you get into the Infowise settings, you basically just create a new SharePoint list and then add all of the fields that are required. And at that point, I can begin to customize using Infowise functionality. One thing that's nice, I can, with Infowise, have parent and child tables, and this is a pretty key function which you would not normally have in SharePoint. This lets me model what I think of as kind of like a simple database, almost like an access database if you built simple solutions like that before or used things like that. So once I've built my list, I have all the fields, then I can come in and start to do the customization that I really need. And that starts with the tab settings. You don't have to kind of remember the sequence necessarily. When you come into the Infowise screen, it kind of helps you. It tells you the order of steps that you go through as you're building these solutions. Also, what's very nice is you have access to a nice training section and documentation, which gives you YouTube videos and pictures and steps that show you how to use all those functions. So really it's pretty accessible. You're not going to have to be stuck and wondering what to do. One thing that I really like is how easy it is to use the configuration. So not only is it cool that I don't have to go and do programming for this, it's very intuitive applying the settings. So one thing that's cool about Infowise is you can have a tabbed interface. Normally in SharePoint, if you have 40 fields in a list, it just scrolls vertically through the form, really doesn't look very nice, and you overwhelm your users. To create tabs, basically I just add them in here, and then I can just map my fields to the tab. Very simple to do that. I just have a list here on the left, and it just shows me which fields, and I just hit my little double arrows, and then that gives me the fields I want in each tab. So that lets me break up the user interface a little bit. Additional to that, we have other settings we can do with permissions, and then when you want to change the look and feel, rather than having to do style sheets or something like that, I have options. Instead of just being stuck with what SharePoint gives me or what you have for the whole farm, I can change the theme of that. I can put like a border around things. I can do different things with the look of that form to make it more polished and customize it. You can use a custom title on the top. There's lots of things I can do to change how the form looks. You certainly would not be able to do that, at least not without any code in SharePoint normally. So I just want to show you real quick what that looks like in the user interface. Okay, so you can see this looks significantly different than what a typical SharePoint form would look like. So I have a custom title bar. We have icons with our fields. You see there's additional fields that you can have access to. This is a signature field, but my interface is broken up. All this information, if I had it in one page in the form, it wouldn't look very good, and it would certainly scroll down the page. So that's what I meant by the tabbed interface. After you have that set up, the next thing that you would look at are the field permissions. It's pretty easy. It's the next thing on the list. You have a lot of control over this. One thing that I find convenient, when you have somebody in the new form, usually you don't want to show them all of the fielded information. So by using column permissions, I can hide fields on the new form and streamline the process. When doing field permissions, I can think in terms of security groups. If I want to restrict the level of access, to managers, for example, I can do it by conditions such as the status of fields. You may have like a project record, and if it's on hold, then I might want people to not be able to update fields. Well, I could set a condition, and I could define that all through configuration. I'm not putting any code in here. So there's a lot of depth to it, but it's very intuitive. I just pick the columns, and whatever I have on my list automatically show in the drop-down. So that's how I would go about doing permissions for fields. After you get through that, the next thing would be to do validation. Normally with SharePoint, you just kind of have a field that says required, and that's about the extent of the validation. So obviously that's not very flexible for us. With Infowise, I have many options I can do with the validation. I can match based on patterns. I can match based on conditions. I can even make the validation per security group. So very much like the field permissions, I have a really detailed level of control as far as how that validation works. So I can get that very custom. But this is not any code. I just use drop-down pickers, and it's going to kind of help me along. So I pick my column and what type of validation, and then just type in a note. So again, if I didn't have these tools, I'd have to be doing some fancy things with JavaScript or jQuery, which would be very challenging and maybe would break if I make updates to it later. So really powerful feature set. Okay, the next part, which is really maybe one of my favorite aspects of Infowise Ultimate Forms, is the actions. And this is the machinery, if you will, of your custom solution. And this is the part where if you were building something outside of Infowise, you would almost always be forced to do custom programming or do some very complicated workflows using SharePoint Designer. So let me talk a little bit about what actions do. This is really something that you would be able to use instead of doing those custom workflows. So now you're putting a power user in a position where they can actually create some of this business process instead of having to try to look at SharePoint Designer and getting stuck with that. Basically all the things that I might otherwise do and SharePoint workflow. Those options are all going to be here for me. There's a lot of depth to this part of the tool set. What I most often use is this update item. Basically, when you create actions, it's just based on your business rule. So when you make something, you've got a business process, and you kind of have to react to those steps. So there's 4 tabs that you work through, and you just make a decision as far as, do I want this activated on the new form or on the edit form, or you could even make it go on a timer, for example. And then there's some advanced settings that normally you would not have to change. And then I indicate on the action settings what I want to happen. So it's kind of like an if this, then that kind of thing. You set a condition that you're listening for, and if that happens, then this action will be triggered. So you can just, set a condition, put it in here, click add, and then, I put the item that I'm doing, and all I have to do is click save, and it just shows up in my actions list. So there's a sequence to that. So if you're thinking in terms of making field updates and things like that, sometimes it might matter the order in which these conditions take place, but all of the logic behind your custom solution can be driven entirely from these actions. And to me, this is really unique. I can't remember seeing anything like this in SharePoint. And what's great is how quickly I can put in those actions. And I can test it really quickly too. See, I'm not in Visual Studio. I don't have to compile a solution and go through several steps to deploy this. When I create an action, I can just save that out, go back to the interface, test it out, and just see if it works the way that I'm supposed to. So there's kind of a rapid feedback loop. When you're doing development, you can put in a little piece and just test it quickly and make sure that you're right on track. That part of it, especially in more highly customized solution, is really a core part, and there's a lot of depth to that. The next thing I want to show you is the email alerts. The SharePoint email alerts really are too limited, and with Infowise, you can, I'm just clicking back to get to my main page. You can do a lot of customization there. So when you have this installed, you're going to see a little icon on your ribbon toolbar. And when you open this up, it gives you this set of tools. So first thing you're going to be able to do is create tools with the email templates. So really easy to use. You've got a visual editor tool, and I can insert field values from my list dynamically. I just kind of use the interface here. Again, I'm not really having to touch any code or anything like that. And then if I want to, I can really dress it up and add some color formatting, things of that nature. So I just create a template and name that. And then that's the content of the email. And then at that point, I can just go through here. I'll show you an example alert. Pretty intuitive. You basically say, okay, well, who do I want it to go through? And then typically you don't want that to be static. Instead of indicating a particular user, what I really want to say is I want this to go to a particular person or something like that. So you can kind of pick that user from the field and add them in there, and it'll just use that dynamic role. And then you set the conditions on when that email is going to go out. So just like with the other, the actions I was setting, I can be very specific about the conditions of when to send those emails. So I have a great level of control as far as when it goes out according to rules. And then also the content of the email can be very nicely polished with a look and feel, just with that visual editor tool. I don't have to enter tool code. The tool's going to take care of that for me. So that's how you do email alert customization. Another thing that is great, sometimes you need to have like a nice report printout. And just printing from your browser, quite honestly, is going to kind of look like garbage. But with Infowise, you're going to be able to get PDF output for that. So there's another icon here, that print icon, and this is showing me kind of a preview of what that would look like. And then I have a PDF icon up here, and I can either email that or just send that out. As far as customizing the printouts, that's very simple to access. So if I go to the Infowise design screen, I can just go in here and, let me find the print section, one second. There it is. Basically, I just pick the fields I want in the printout. There's two modes. We've got like a simple and advanced mode for printouts, but I can create it as many kind of print templates as I want, so I can do custom headers and footers and that type of thing. As far as one thing I said I would comment on this, as far as limitations to this kind of development, my background is as a Microsoft web developer, and I really find that I don't have to go into other tools to do anything. So on one hand, I find that this tool set's very accessible for building basic solutions, but even for somebody with a programming background, you might be concerned, well, if this is for power users, they can use it, then it doesn't have the power that I would want to do, like as a programmer. And that's absolutely not the case. I've built applications that are used concurrently by a couple hundred users with very in-depth processes. For example, in the actions, there may be 40 to 50 actions, 14 different email alert rules, lots and lots of customization. So it can really scale very effectively, and I find that really neat. So it's accessible to the people I'm working with, but at the same time it has a level of complexity where I can kind of take it a step further if I want to. Okay, so I'm going to jump to questions in a second. Before I forget to do it, though, I just want to mention that there's a free download on the Infowise site. As I mentioned, you can get this either for Office 365 or for on-premise for all SharePoint versions. That would be definitely your best starting point. Another thing, if you're kind of curious about our product, but you have more questions and you want to talk to us more, please reach out to us and schedule a demo. If you want to just send an email to me directly, that's fine too. I am Will C at InfowiseSolutions.com. And I always like to talk to customers and see what kind of unique challenges that you're working with. And then also the other thing I want to mention, there just is a lot of training content on our site. And another thing that we do for new customers, you could take a look at, we do a really in-depth lab-style training, which typically lasts 4 to 5 hours, where we really kind of walk you through and help you to learn how to be good at using the tool set. I just had a session yesterday that went great. And I think that's a part of the process that could really help your team ramp up if that's something you're concerned about. So there's the training section. Another thing that's cool, we have lots of blog entries and comments on kind of new development things that we're doing and new things with the product. So that's something you can take a look at. So with that being said, let me just check and see what kind of questions we got. Just one second. Lots of questions. Okay, and by the way, I'm sorry if I don't answer it on the webinar, but I'll just try to go through the list real quick. As far as getting a copy of the recording, yes, I'm going to post that on the website after, so you can just watch that. I always load those up to YouTube, so you'll be able to get to do that, no problem. As far as like targeted solutions or very particular things you're doing, really this is a tool platform, and it can be used for just about any kind of solution you're doing. We do have some example templates on the site. And then also we've done some webinars showing examples of types of solutions. So if you have something specific in mind, you're not sure how you would implement that, reach out to us. That's something we could cover in a demo if you have a very particular thing that you want to build. SharePoint for rapid development. Yeah, I mean, I think that was something I covered. One aspect to it I mentioned, when you're building solutions, you're able to basically check the process very quickly. One thing I do typically, I'm building solutions directly in the production environment. You don't necessarily have to do it in a QA environment. So I tend to build solutions, get them in front of the customer very quickly, get feedback quickly, make adjustments on the fly. Much better development process than kind of going behind a curtain for a month and then coming out. So really the customers get involved in the process very early on. As far as themes, really that just has to do with the form customization. You can enter your own CSS if you want to, but that was in the tab settings. We have a lot of entries in the training section where I describe how to customize the header, the fields, how to embed diagrams. There's a lot of possibilities on that. So you would start by just picking from the options in the tab settings interface. You can try different options there. That would be the starting point. If you would take a little further, you can put in a little CSS or have somebody help you that, which is really easy to do. Let's see. As far as jQuery, the product does use some jQuery in there, but it's not going to cause a conflict with any other jQuery customization you have, so that shouldn't be a concern. So if you want to add that in there, you can. If you already have it in your farm, it's really not going to pose a conflict, so it shouldn't be a concern for you. There's not really a restriction on that. Are the actions some kind of workflow engine? Really, behind the scenes, the actions basically trigger workflow, so absolutely. I really don't use SharePoint workflow for the most part when I do solutions because all of the things that you would trigger there, you can replace by using actions instead. The advantage is that it's a lot more accessible and I can deploy it much more quickly using the actions tool through Infowise. And it's all encapsulated to the interface, so it becomes a stronger approach because it's together with the rest of the configuration. Let's pick a couple more and then we'll close. Oh, the in progress, why is it continuing circling? Well, that was just like an animated GIF, so normally we don't use those type of icons. I know that's kind of a user preference thing. As far as the icons you saw in there, you can use any type of icons you want. Infowise has loads of options in there. There's 250, but you can also load your own custom set, and there's actually a training post on how you could do that. So if you have particular icons you want to use, you can do that. Export to Excel, that's just baked into SharePoint. So nothing changes. Just because you change this list to use Infowise, it doesn't restrict any SharePoint functions, so you can continue to export to Excel if you need to. You do not have to deploy this tool to your desktop. It's just all entirely self-contained to SharePoint. So as far as deployment, there's nothing other than just putting it on your SharePoint farm. As far as moving from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013 or other upgrades, really it's pretty seamless. I actually just went through this 2 days ago with a major customer, and this product does support both, and it really it doesn't cause any problem to you when you do that update. If you have kind of deeper concerns on that, you can follow up to us and we can get more specific, but basically you can just upgrade your SharePoint farm and it's not going to cause any problems. All your existing Infowise related solutions are going to keep working just the way that they already had. Okay, I think that's about all I'm going to cover in questions. If I didn't happen to get to it on here, we'll try to continue answering questions in the chat, so please hang on. And if for some other reason we miss you, I ask you please do send me a personal email once again to willc@infowisesolutions.com, or you can just direct them to Infowise in general through the website. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining me for the presentation today. I really appreciate your time, and please do reach out to us. We certainly like to talk to you, and we'll try to help answer any questions or your concerns on the product, but I do hope you take the opportunity to try this out by downloading and installing the free demo. Thank you very much, and have a good day.